Well, welcome everybody my name is John Myers from HR&A Advisors. We're going to go through today a webinar about the drivers of energy efficiency and affordable housing. We're very excited about this as part of our ongoing series. And we're going to start with some housekeeping and other announcements. I want to turn first to Anna, who is going to be able to provide translation for us today. So Anna, do you want to explain that process? And if we can go to the next slide.
Yes, thank you, John. Hola, buenos días. Yo soy Ana Vidales y voy a ser su intérprete. There you go. Si ustedes quieren escuchar este webinar en español, tienen que ver que está esta pequeña globo mundial que dice interpretación. Van a español y tienen la opción de silenciar el audio original. Si ustedes silencian el audio original, solo escucharán a la intérprete. Si lo dejan abierto, escucharán al intérprete a un 80% y al ponente a un 20%. Si ustedes están uniéndose a nosotros por medio de un teléfono o un iPad, tienen que ir a los 3 puntitos donde dice More, eligen Language Interpretation. Lo mismo aplica con respecto a silenciar el audio original, eligen su idioma y es bien importante que al final aprieten Done o Listo. Muchísimas gracias. Thank you. You can turn on interpretation now.
Wonderful. Thank you, Anna. If we can go to the next slide, just to go through some important housekeeping and announcements. We are recording this webinar and we'll be making it available to all the registrants within a few business days. If you have a question during the webinar, at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A button. Please submit your question there. You can also upvote other folks' questions if there's things that you want us to make sure that we prioritize. You may use the chat, which will be monitored throughout. Please keep that conversation respectful and productive with other participants. And R2E2 throughout this process will not tolerate any behavior that causes harm or is disruptive to the environment of this webinar. If you have any concerns, please direct message Carolyn Conant on this chat. If you feel any unsafe at any point in this space, and disruptive participants may be removed from the webinar during the course of our time today. With those housekeeping and announcements, I'm going to turn it to Nate Allen from the U.S. Department of Energy, who's going to introduce Buildings Up.
Thank you so much, John. I take it you can hear me. Raise your hand if not. I want to thank you, everyone at ACEEE, and the volume of attendees who have decided to join us. Thank you so much. I'm really pleased by the turnout on this webinar. I am joining you from the DOE Building Technologies Office Peer Review this week, where what I'm about to discuss has featured very prominently from our plenaries into sessions, and including from high-level DOE officials, which I think is a wonderful sign. I have just stepped out of a session to cover this from my colleague, Holly Carr, and I'm on my phone in a closet, so I'm hopeful that the IP works clearly. I apologize if not. My name is Nate Allen. I'm a program manager on our commercial buildings integration team, and I'm really pleased to get to speak with you about what I think is one of the most exciting new initiatives out of DOE right now, and I'm glad to be able to present it alongside of R2E2. This is a new initiative from the Building Technologies Office announced by our secretary in January of this year. The Buildings Upgrade Prize, or Buildings Up as we call it for short, is designed to rapidly scale energy efficiency and efficient electrification upgrades to existing buildings all across the country. This is not a prize to upgrade a single building, but rather to develop an initiative that will complete many building upgrades within a building upgrade zone. We'll talk about that in a second. The prize is envisioned to consist of 4 phases over approximately 5 years. That's subject to approvals and the availability of funds. Right now we're focused on phase 1, which is the concept phase of the prize, where we will award over $22 million in cash prizes and technical assistance to teams. Applications for phase 1 opened on February 18th. They close on July 18th, 2023. And we are seeking 20 to 60 winning teams to join the Buildings Up co-opetition. call it a co-opetition rather than a competition, because we are not looking to crown a single winning team at the end. Instead, we want as many teams as possible to move through the phases of this prize successfully and working together and learning from one another. Let's go to the next slide, and we'll talk about prize goals. Buildings Up aims to address the persistent administrative, financial, social, and other barriers to energy efficiency and reducing on-site emissions from the existing buildings. We have the technologies to get there. We have efficient electric equipment like heat pump water heaters, building efficiency measures such as air installation, air sealing, everything we've been discussing here this week at peer review. But we need to make these technologies more accessible. Only about 1 to 2% of buildings in the country are retrofitted for energy upgrades each year. Not fast enough. We need innovations to address the non-technical barriers like the persistent financial, social, administrative, and other challenges to improve our buildings. We aim to address this through Buildings Up by providing capacity building through this prize that will support teams develop solutions that, sorry, that's I'm in the closet, accelerate building upgrades beyond best practices, are replicable and scalable, are built to last beyond the period of the prize, and seek to benefit underserved communities by ensuring that at least 40% of the prize benefits accrue to equity-eligible buildings, which we'll talk about in a second, their occupants and the surrounding community. Let's go to the next slide and talk about the pathways. Perfect, yes, thank you. So we are asking applicants to select one of two pathways. The Equity-Centered Innovation Pathway will award $400,000 in cash prizes for each winning team. For this pathway, teams will commit at least 80% of their building upgrade initiative implementation on equity-eligible buildings, which I'm going to explain in the next slide. The Open Innovation Pathway will award $200,000 in cash prizes for each winning team. This pathway, applicants are not required to focus on equity-eligible buildings. Technical assistance will be provided to build out concept submissions into implementation plans to all winning teams. I will make that point. For both pathways, teams will submit a concept for an initiative that can achieve scalability and replicability of building upgrades in a specified geographic area or within a building type. And I've mentioned capacity building, but I want to make sure this point is clear. So this prize will not pay for building upgrades on its own. It's intended to cover the capacity building for perhaps dedicated staff in organizations and communities to focus on developing innovative upgrade initiatives that can leverage other sources of funding, perhaps federal and local sources, et cetera. And we intend for teams that are selected during phase one to be invited to continue participating in future phases. Let's keep moving because we've got a couple more points I want to cover and not a lot of time. I want to talk about equity-eligible buildings and make sure that I'm clear on how we're defining this. So for the purpose of this prize, equity-eligible buildings are defined in 4 categories to meet the requirements for the Equity-Centered Innovation Pathway. First, around geographic location, buildings located within Justice 40 Census Tract tribal lands, federally and non-federally recognized, and U.S. territories are equity eligible. Second, affordable housing and housing occupied by low-income residents, including subsidized affordable housing, naturally occurring affordable rental housing, and homes occupied by low-income households. Third, underserved commercial, nonprofit, and public buildings, including buildings used by small disadvantaged businesses, those that serve disadvantaged communities, Title I schools, buildings used by nonprofit organizations that provide localized community services, buildings that provide critical community services and disaster resilience hubs, or buildings otherwise defined as equity-eligible buildings through community or local input. And then fourth, team defined. So we recognize there may not be specific local conditions or considerations that would make buildings equity eligible, such as areas with job loss due to energy transition, weather emergencies, linguistic isolation, etc. So applicants can create a local definition of equity eligible buildings and submit for consideration by the prize team. There's additional information on equity eligible buildings in section 3.5 of the official rules. At the end of my presentation, there's a QR code to access those rules. So we'll get there in just a moment. Why don't we quickly go through? I'm going to, on example projects, this next slide. Perfect. Yeah, there are several different examples of projects that applicants could propose for buildings up. One that intrigues me here is a community-based organization in a mid-sized town that partners with their local government to bring heat pumps to affordable housing buildings in their community. But it need not be that. For all proposed initiatives, Buildings Up is seeking innovation in overcoming the persistent and non-technical barriers. Let's keep moving to the next slide. These could include lack of contractor or occupant familiarity with technologies, high upfront costs for upgrades, insufficient workforce to scale upgrades, lack of reach of funding and incentive programs, inconsistent quality of upgrades, and more. Why don't we conclude then with the final slide? And I mentioned the Hero X page earlier on. Yeah, wonderful. The link shown here and the QR code, you can access the Follow the Prize, read the rules, apply for the phase 1. There's information about an application support bonus prize. I should flag that actually closed the third round of it 2 days ago. So that time has passed, but there's still a lot that can be found on our Hero X portal about this prize. We have additional information, training sessions and webinars coming up. These are all posted to Hero X, and the email address listed here, buildingsup@nrel.gov, is really the best place for questions that are not addressed right now. We all monitor that inbox to make sure to respond in a timely manner. And I think with that, I'm going to pass it to my colleague to discuss R2E2, and I thank you again for allowing me the chance to speak to you all this afternoon.
Thank you so much, Nate. If we can go to the next slide, we'll introduce our speakers today. Again, I'm John Myers. I'm a partner with HR&A Advisors. Callie, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, yes, I'm Callie Seltzer. I'm a principal with HR&A Advisors. Thank you for joining us today. Hannah?
I'm Hannah Glosser, a director at HR&A Advisors, and I'll pass it to Lauren.
Sure. Hi, everyone, and thank you to the organizers for the invitation to participate today. I'm Lauren Ross, Senior Advisor for Housing and Sustainability in the Office of Multifamily at HUD. I'm also just going to use this time to say a few words about HUD's commitment here. I'm not necessarily presenting on today's webinar, but I will be around for Q&A and any HUD-related questions. But as I said, I'm really excited to be joining today. But more importantly, HUD is very excited to be partnering with DOE and R2E2 on the Buildings Up Prize. We see this as a key opportunity to bring much needed innovation to accelerate clean energy upgrades in our existing affordable housing stock. As we'll be discussing today, I'm sure retrofits in the affordable multifamily sector are really needed more than ever. And with the unprecedented amount of funding in the pipeline, we need solutions that work for owners and residents. We're hopeful that the lasting partnerships between building owners, government, industry, and utilities that will result from this work will lead to lasting change in the sector. I'll also say that HUD continues to do our part too. More and more, we're identifying opportunities to align building and substantial rehabilitation incentives and requirements with energy efficiency and equitable decarbonization goals. But we also need industry and resources to align as well. And in addition to responding to the climate crisis, and I'm sure which will be a big focus of today's discussion, we know that these investments lead to immediate utility savings for both owners and residents, as well as making our units more comfortable, safer, and healthier. So I'll stop there, but I'm really looking forward to today's discussion. And so I'll turn it back to John. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lauren. If we can go to the next slide, I'll quickly introduce HR&A, the firm, and what we're going to try to cover today. HR&A is a consulting firm. We have 6 offices now around the country, and working in cities, as you can see, across the United States with a deep commitment to improving life in America's cities. We have decades of experience in the intersecting worlds of housing and energy efficiency investments, and it's something that we have had the honor of being a part of across a huge range of geography. If we can go to the next slide. Our housing affordability work really focuses on 4 sort of connected sets of work. There's housing strategies at a sort of citywide or regional, or in some cases neighborhood level. Housing policy, so largely working with governments to help understand community goals, and then regulations, incentives, and other policies associated with those goals. Program design, again, how to design programs, public-private programs that align to those community goals. More and more in the last few years, these have included energy efficiency and energy investment programs. And then last but not least, we are involved and have been involved in a huge range of development and preservation of housing at all levels of affordability, again, in a variety of geographies around the country. So that's, I think, a helpful introduction to our perspective on this extremely complicated and exciting topic. If we can go to the next slide. So our intention today is that by the end of this presentation, you should have a deeper and sort of nuanced understanding of the basics of housing, the basics of affordable housing in particular, how it's defined and how it's created. You should also be able to identify the benefits of pursuing building upgrades within that affordable housing stock. You should be able to recognize the barriers to achieving those building upgrades, and working in your groups, be able to prioritize among building upgrade outcomes, which will help you to develop a plan so that you know the goals that you're trying to achieve and that your policies are in turn aligned with those. We can go to the next. As Nate was alluding to, this is building into the ongoing buildings up process. On the right-hand side of the slide here, you can see the phase 1 scoring criteria. Today's work is really going to be focusing on the first, second, and fifth of those. So helping to understand and assess priorities and challenges, how to address those challenges through innovation, to begin to design local scopes and local impacts, and then ultimately to be able to achieve equitable building upgrade strategies, focusing on equity-centered innovation, and how that will play out regionally throughout the country. We can go to the next slide. So with all of that in mind, our agenda today is to start, I think, with an understanding of affordable housing. What does it mean? Then a primer on building upgrades. What do those mean? What drives those building upgrades in affordable housing? And then in section 4, bringing those two things together to help to understand how to think about priorities within the intersection of affordable housing and energy upgrades. And last but not least, Q&A. Again, if you have questions throughout the process, please don't hesitate to type those questions into the question and answer box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. With that agenda, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Callie, who is going to take our first section here. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Hope everyone can hear me. Well, welcome again, everyone. If we can go to the first slide of the primer. Thank you. All right, so we're going to start off today talking about affordable housing. What is it? Who lives in it? What are some of the different types? There are many. And as we talk about the different types of housing today, we'll also get into some of the characteristics that affordable housing or housing that is affordable that they share related to energy systems and age of systems and energy usage. Next slide, please. So when someone says what's affordable housing or this is affordable housing, that can mean a lot of different things. And to sort of simplify for today, I would like for folks to think of it as kind of a people-centric definition. So for anyone you know, we consider that their housing is affordable. Your housing is affordable if it doesn't cost you more than a third of your income. for your housing cost and your utilities. So that could be your rent plus your utilities. That could be your mortgage plus your utilities. So think about affordable housing in the people-centric sense, right? That if you found quality housing that suits your needs and you're not paying more than 30% of your income, then that housing is affordable for you. For many people, as you know, and particularly people who are lower moderate income and people who live in very expensive housing markets, or some combination of both, it can be very difficult to find housing where they aren't paying more than 30% of their income toward rent or even a mortgage. For a small number of those people, there is subsidy available to help them have a more affordable housing cost that makes their housing cost more affordable for them based on their income. So sometimes there is subsidy involved in housing, and that's also called affordable housing. But I think just keeping in mind, whenever you hear affordable housing, you kind of have to ask the question, affordable for whom? And if you think about your own income and you think about the rent or the mortgage you pay plus your utilities every month, if that exceeds a third of your overall income, then we would say you have some level of housing burden. We're going to talk a little more about housing burden today, but just kind of as a starting point to this conversation, you'll see that on this slide, we've got kind of the breakdown of what area median income is for people who are considered low income or very low income or extremely low income. Next slide, please. So for households in the US that spend more than 30% of their income a month on housing and utilities, those are considered housing burdened. As we said, it's a cost burden for them. And really it's quite basic, right? Housing is too much of their monthly budget. It doesn't leave enough cushion for other necessary expenses, savings. So in this example on the right, you've got a family of 2 working adults and 2 children living in Chicago metro area. And the average annual housing cost there is $15,628. And to afford that, the family would need to earn with 2 income adults, $109,000, and that's a monthly income of over $9,000. So that's in order for them to not be housing burdened. Next slide, please. We're going to talk a little bit about the types of housing and types of subsidy that is put into housing in this country in order to make it more affordable for people who can't afford the kind of the market price of housing in the place where they live. So this is supposed to be a spectrum. It's not a perfect spectrum. You'll see this no subsidy on the left and then higher subsidy levels on the right. Really just think of this as, there's a lot of types of housing in the US where the government, whether it's local, state, or federal, in some way is providing either a subsidy or has an expenditure, such as like a tax credit or the mortgage interest program for mortgage interest reduction program. So on the far left here, when we say naturally occurring affordable housing, you might have heard this term before, but that's housing in your community that doesn't have any subsidy. It's privately owned. It can be a single family house. It can be apartments. It's privately owned. It's often older. So the cost to live there is just lower due to the age of the building or other kind of factors. It's not kind of the shiniest, newest thing on the block typically, but it's a critical source of housing for that's affordable for people who may not have access to or don't qualify for any housing subsidy. They're able to find housing that's affordable that doesn't have subsidy. Moving across this continuum, you'll see that we also listed the federal first-time homebuyer credit. This, along with like the mortgage interest reduction payment, those are government expenditures to encourage home ownership. A lot of those benefits actually go to higher income households, many of whom could actually afford to own a home without assistance. But meanwhile, close to half of homeowners with mortgages, many of them in the middle and lower income band, don't actually get this benefit. But we put it here because it's important to recognize that we subsidize housing in a large variety of ways in this country. And we subsidize housing for low, middle, and also higher income households in the US. through a variety of different tools. There's also direct subsidy. So you see on here, home and CDBG, those are federal block grant programs. HUD administers several federal programs that assist state and local governments and nonprofits and other partners to develop homeownership or rental units for lower income households. And so home and CDBG are two of those very important programs. As you know, there's a huge need for affordable housing that often exceeds the resources available. So it's important that state and local governments make really strategic decisions about how to spend those dollars. Moving on this continuum, you'll typically find a deeper level of subsidy in what's called a Section 8 project or a Section 8 housing unit, or a voucher that's also part of the overall Section 8 program that HUD administers. It's structured to assist very low-income families, the elderly, and also people with different abilities to help them find housing that's affordable for them. And it essentially, Section 8 will pay the difference between the market rate of that housing unit and what the individual or that family can actually afford without, again, exceeding 30% of their income. Critical program, shrinking number of units over the past 30 years, and important to kind of distinguish that from other types of federally subsidized housing. We also put on here permanent supportive housing. This type of housing might have some of these other sources involved, but it also has on-site support services. There's typically a physical or mental distinguishing disability at the household level. So people need some sort of on-site supportive services. Often people have been exiting homelessness, and permanent supportive housing is a critical resource for people. Public housing on the far right. Public housing, once had a huge amount of investment in it, but that was many years ago. And over time, it has, the systems have aged, the buildings have aged, and it's publicly owned housing, it's publicly subsidized with a lot of backlog of capital needs. So we'll go on to the next slide and talk about kind of how to distinguish between housing that's considered affordable to low and moderate income households, that's subsidized, either publicly owned or deed restricted. So not all units of housing, as we said in the beginning, that are considered affordable are actually subsidized, right? If you have housing that's affordable for you and you're not paying more than 30% of your income on that housing and utilities, like, you do actually have an affordable housing situation. You're not subsidized necessarily, maybe you are. A lot of units are unrestricted and unsubsidized, right? There's no voucher involved. There's no kind of federal resource financing the site, the housing side of the project. So they don't have a deed restriction about who can live there. Whatever that person's income, it's not restricted. And so often when we talk about subsidized public or deed restricted units, we're really talking about a very small number of units overall in this country. We put 4% on here. That's the percent of overall housing units that actually receive some kind of subsidy in exchange for a use restriction that says, a family that qualifies by income or some other factor can live here. It's a very small number. They're critical because there is that subsidy attached to them, and subsidy is a scarce resource. And if those units aren't maintained, that subsidy can be in jeopardy, the units can be in jeopardy, but what that really means is, the housing condition for people living there is at stake, and subsidy is very limited to, repair and maintain those units. Next slide, please. So thinking about these unsubsidized units, right? They may still be affordable based on the rent level, as we mentioned earlier, these NOAA, naturally occurring affordable housing. Doesn't have subsidy, it's privately owned, often it's older. The cost to live there is just lower due to its age. Again, not the newest or shiniest thing on the block. And you can see the NOAA band here in kind of a brighter blue color, housing that is affordable to households earning less than 80% of the area median income. Next slide, please. This is the bulk of housing in, affordable housing in the United States. Naturally occurring affordable housing, it typically refers to properties that are not subsidized, again, by any federal, state, local program. There's no rent regulation, no rent restriction, and they are considered affordable to people at 80% of AMI for that location. The housing stock that's unsubsidized here, this is also due to limited amount of subsidy sources and a critical resource to protect. Next slide, please. So we think NOAA stock makes up about 30% of the total housing stock. Again, it's the vast majority of affordable housing stock. And we think there's about 19 million units nationally of NOAA housing. Here's a sample on the right, Park Square Apartments in Alexandria, Virginia. Sort of small scale, 66 units of rental housing, naturally occurring affordable housing. You'll see here, we also have an example of San Diego. 90% of all the unrestricted NOAA units in San Diego were actually built before 1990. So just getting that sense of, these are often older buildings and they're smaller, often smaller. Next slide, please. So we talked about NOAA, and now we're going to talk about housing that is deed restricted or subsidized. And that comes through either a state, local, or federal restriction, a program or a policy. So the green band, that really small amount overall, we don't have actually that many subsidized units in this country compared to the need. But these are units that are considered affordable to people earning 80% of AMI or below. Some units are subsidized through such as like a public housing authority, right? So you might have a voucher that a housing authority administers, or you might have an actual public housing unit. The low-income housing tax credit program is not a direct subsidy to tenants. It's actually a financing program that uses tax credits, but the units that are built with it have to be affordable for folks earning under 60%, or roughly averaging to 60% of AMI. And those limits are set by HUD. Some may also be regulated affordable but unsubsidized. So we have in this country, you may be aware, inclusionary zoning and rent control. So those are programs that prevent the rent growth in some or all of the units. Next slide, please. So subsidized housing does tend to be older, similar to the NOAA units, tends to not be that energy efficient, and it can be at risk of loss of affordability due to the building age and obsolescence. So for instance, more than 70% of public housing units that were built between 1950 and 1985 have systems that are beyond their useful life and have a backlog of capital needs. That does not fully capture the picture of like how hard a lot of housing authorities are working to keep up with those units, but there just isn't enough money available at the federal level and appropriated by Congress to actually maintain, those systems. There's high utility costs. So 22% of public housing operating budgets go to utilities. Reducing these costs would help preserve affordability and also generate savings for taxpayers. And then, some of these subsidized housing units also are in high-risk locations. So high-risk areas for loss due to natural hazard. That can be coastal flooding, drought, earthquakes, hurricanes, and you all are aware that hyper-local question wherever you're based, but just think about the fact that we do have this overlay of units that have a backlog of capital needs and might be in places of extreme climate concern. Next slide, please. All right, we're going to do a primer on building upgrades. Apologize for the sirens in my background. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague.
Thanks, Callie. Now that we've covered some of the basics of affordable housing, we're going to delve into building upgrades. What are they? Why do them? And what's expected as part of the building's up prize? So first, Building upgrades make a building more efficient through conversion of a building's heating, hot water, and other systems to electric equivalents. Building upgrade programs can include many different types of upgrades depending on the scope and goals of what you're trying to accomplish. So, and you can see on the slide here, at a baseline, building upgrades can include repair or replacement of energy efficiency, electrification, and health and safety measures. They can also include repair or replacement of water conservation, smart devices, energy storage, EV charging, and renewable energy. The minimum technologies for the buildings uprise are weatherization and envelope improvements to reduce energy costs where needed, and also efficient electric heating and cooling equipment. And it's important to note that depending on your local context, you may need to advance health and safety upgrades before those can occur. And beyond that, for the building's upgrade prize, you can consider whether to include additional technologies or strategies that are included in that bottom band, like energy storage or EV charging. And if we go to the next slide, so building upgrades frequently include multiple types of initiatives. So each box here represents different types of initiatives or elements of initiatives that can support building upgrades. So an example of that is on the left-hand side, you'll see the first box is energy efficiency rebates. And a utility may offer energy efficiency rebates for heating or cooling equipment. As an alternative example, you could be combining these rebates with another initiative. So, for example, local government's benchmarking program could market these rebates offered by utility. And this would be a way to combine different elements to increase impact, again, depending on your goals. So there's really a lot of ways to advance upgrades in a multitude of different approaches that can be advanced on their own or coupled together. And if we go to the next slide, this is all really in service of kind of the impact and benefits we're seeking here. So building upgrades can create a multitude of benefits for communities, in particular underserved communities. For example, a building upgrade can increase climate resilience. For example, that means reducing GHG emissions. It can also improve health, comfort, and safety, like reducing exposure to mold, improving indoor air quality, and reducing exposure to gas leaks. It can also increase affordability by reducing energy bills and in turn enabling households to dedicate that budget to other essential needs, which Callie started to talk about earlier. In addition, building upgrades can support the local economy by creating local jobs. And it can also promote racial equity by ensuring upgrades center community priorities and benefit BIPOC communities that have been historically excluded. So today we're really delving into how teams can thoughtfully set priorities and plan to really realize these benefits, and with a particular focus on affordability. And if you do have more questions throughout this webinar on these other benefits, please share them. And we also encourage you to go to HeroX and peruse the other webinar topics, which touch on these topics as well. So depending on your goal, there are a number of strategies that can be advanced as a part of building upgrade. And again, as a reminder, the buildings up teams, you must include envelope/weatherization measures and efficient electric equipment in their concept plans, and that the other items listed here are optional. But it's really important to think about your team's goal, and based on that, you'll be able to determine the appropriate solutions to pursue, whether that be an individual strategy like scaling heat pump installations to increase electric equipment, or pursuing that in combination with other upgrades like adding wall insulation to really create a comprehensive approach to reducing energy usage. So here's this breakdown of what that looks like across each kind of typology. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see that each intervention does produce, different outcomes. So as you, again, develop your concept plans, you should think thoughtfully about your primary goals and use these goals to prioritize. So for example, if your team's primary goal is cost reduction, you may develop a set of solutions that are different if your primary goal is reducing energy consumption. So an example of this is if your goal is to only reduce energy costs for tenants, you can just subsidize that cost and reduce burden on low-income households as New York does. You can have all three as goals: energy costs, energy consumption, and carbon emissions. But you'll have to weigh potential solutions and strategies across these goals and inevitably make some trade-offs. And my colleague John will discuss this further in a minute. And then on the next slide, as your team considers kind of the different strategies to advance as part of the building upgrade, it's worth also considering potential phasing, which is a really effective strategy to scaling this work. You can see on the right-hand side in this diagram, upgrade A is doing all the upgrade at once, while upgrade B is pictured here, advances a full envelope upgrade in the first stage, and then the installation of electric equipment in the second stage, while then upgrade C in the first stage combines some priority envelope and efficiency measures like air and duct sealing with equipment replacement like a HVAC equipment upgrade. And the second stage includes the remaining envelope and equipment investments. So it really depends on your local context and, again, the measures you're prioritizing, but I think worth considering whether you should pursue in phases. I'll now pass it to my colleague John to discuss this further.
Thank you very much, Hannah. So we've got, I think, a pretty good introduction to what kinds of investments would entail building upgrades. And now I think we're going to go through in a little bit more detail how those decisions get made. If we can go to the next slide, there are three different perspectives that are important in understanding how building upgrades happen in the context of affordable housing. There are the owners and lenders, financiers, which, excuse me, there are sort of with the new incentives and Inflation Reduction Act funds, some really important new opportunities here that I think will be a key piece of this work. Then the second is the sort of builders and operators of affordable housing, both again regulated and unregulated, as Callie was describing, for whom a phased approach to delivery is a really important aspect for buildings that are already existing. And then last, but certainly not least, the tenants and advocates for those who live in multifamily rental in particular, for whom the opportunity now to use this as a way both to improve the quality of life and affordability for tenants. So housing quality, both in terms of the building itself, as well as air quality and other really important improvements, but also balancing the need for affordability and the desire to reduce displacement and other very real and very important housing concerns. If we go to the next slide for a second. So taking these sort of perspectives now in somewhat more granular detail, from the perspective of a building owner, just to take the simplest way of thinking about this, there are certainly building owners for whom investments are made for environmental reasons, but for most building owners, investments are made either because there is a cost savings, so there's an economic rationale associated with the investment, so I can put up some money now and I will recoup it in time as my energy cost goes down. So you can see on the right-hand side of the slide there, a conceptual way of thinking about solar panels, for example, which is that you pay to install the panels, but you pay that cost off through reduced energy costs over time. There is also a very real sort of decision pathway associated with regulatory compliance. So I'm going to make a building upgrade because I have to. Local law says I have to, or other regulations say that I have to. And again, either becomes an important sort of decision perspective from a building owner's point of view about why such investments might be made and how they would be evaluated. If we can go to the next slide. It's also important, as Callie was reflecting in the conversation about affordable housing, that obviously not all owners are the same, and owners make decisions based on very different criteria. So in the non-regulated rental housing world, most of that is funded through private capital. It can be accessed relatively quickly, but it needs to be returned with interest, even in the case of a public incentive. Those owners tend to be very interested in the increase in asset value that might be associated with an investment, including the potential to recoup higher rent, and also decrease operating costs. So to the extent that an investment might decrease operating costs, it becomes more attractive. For the subsidized housing building owner, marketplace decision-making is much different. The funding streams tend to be much more heavily reliant on government, although there is often a mix of government and private funding. It often takes longer to put together the capital investment needed to fund a building upgrade project, though the return required is generally lower, again, because of that mix of government and private funding, or because of the use of tax incentives or other things. And in general, these properties are sort of viewed as a long-term hold. So asset value increase tends to be less of a high priority, with a much greater focus on housing quality, but certainly as well on decrease in energy cost and improving the operating bottom line of a building. We can go to the next slide, please. From the tenant perspective, building upgrades again, can be a really important opportunity here to increase tenant comfort. And that may mean something as simple as having a thermostat in your apartment, as opposed to having the heat controlled centrally, or air conditioning controlled centrally, depending on where you live and what time of year. Overall, again, housing quality associated with the reduction in reliance on fossil fuels, as well as indoor air quality and other emitting pollutants, that are linked to adverse health impacts, and ultimately reduction in utility costs, which, as Callie was describing, when we think about housing cost burden, it is both the cost of the rent as well as the cost of associated heat, hot water, and other utilities. So any reduction in those can be very significant for a tenant. If we can go to the next slide, but it is important to acknowledge that these are really fundamental investments and often face sort of structural challenges, both from the owner side and from the tenant side. So from the owner's perspective, there is a general sense of uncertainty about the necessary high costs and really uncertain payback periods associated with what are in some cases relatively new technologies. And a lack of familiarity and, frankly, a lack of priority. Most of these folks are in the business of operating housing, and energy is not necessarily the first priority in that conversation, for reasons we can discuss in a little bit. From the tenant perspective, particularly some of the more intense electrification investments, heat pumps, for example, can be quite disruptive. A building upgrade project, takes building systems offline. It may involve people coming in and out of tenants' apartments. That's quite a disruption. There is also a very real risk for many tenants of either rising rent associated with building upgrades or tenant displacement associated with building investments. or cost increases to the tenant themselves, again, associated with utility bills or other things. So there are some very important kind of structural barriers that exist right now to many of these really significant building upgrade projects. If we can go to the next slide, and sort of diving a little bit more granularly into some of this from the owner perspective, again, in the absence of incentives in most energy markets right now in the United States, building upgrades require very significant, in some cases, upfront costs, including labor and equipment, service upgrades potentially on the electrical grid, with a fairly unclear financial payback in terms of utility savings and operating expenses associated with those investments. So the financial calculus is often not clear or speculative at long term. And again, there's just a general unfamiliarity with some of these building systems and how they operate. And again, for many owners, these are an afterthought in the context of the complexity of operating multifamily rental housing across most of the United States. If we go to the next slide, taking just as an example, looking at a large rent stabilized property in New York City, where we collect tremendously robust data about operating expenses. What you can see here on the right-hand side are the overall monthly operating expenses associated with older multifamily rent stabilized property in the outer boroughs in New York. And what you can see there is that fuel and utility expenses account for about 18% of all of that. So from the perspective of the owner, if someone says, well, you know, I can save you 5% on your fuel costs by investing in efficiency, that's a very small piece of the overall pie of how that owner is thinking about operating that building. And so they may be well-intentioned, but it can take a pretty significant level of incentive to elevate that within the priorities of the way the owner is thinking about operating that building. If we can go to the next slide. From the tenant perspective, similar dynamics are in play, right? If we have a household that is rent burdened, its housing burden is a mix of both rent and utilities. So it is really sort of alleviating that burden depends on reducing some combination of both of those levers below the level at which their housing cost and housing occupancy costs, so housing and utilities combined, might be lower than 30% of their gross income. We can go to the next slide. So sort of to think through all of these forces kind of thoughtfully requires a pretty holistic understanding of housing and energy together. And it is clearly the case that there are risks to low and moderate income tenants associated with significant investments in housing. And so understanding, as you think about your local approaches, understanding local housing markets, and understanding how those kinds of investments might impact low and moderate income tenants is a really important aspect of it. How does it affect rent? And then very importantly, in many markets, the particularly electrification, whether that's heating, hot water, cooking equipment, may be paired with a switch from a central meter. So the tenant is not paying an electric bill or a gas bill because it's being centrally metered within their building, to individual unit meters, which in turn often means a cost shift so that the tenant may now be receiving an electric bill, which they had not previously been doing. And that does not necessarily mean that rent will go down. So again, the tenant cost overall may go up associated with an energy investment, which is not the intent of that investment, but may be a very real outcome. And again, part of the effort here is to make sure that local teams are thinking about overall housing cost burden and how to reduce that housing cost burden for low and moderate income households. We can go to the next slide, please. So thinking about this in a hopefully somewhat more clear visual manner, On the left-hand side, we have a multifamily building where the owner is paying the utility bills. So the owner is investing in energy efficiency. The owner's paying the utility bill that will presumably go down as a result of that investment. The tenant, though, is not in a financial position where they are involved in that transaction and not necessarily incentivized to conserve energy or reduce those costs. On the other hand, on the right-hand side of the slide, we have the tenant paying a utility bill, in which case the tenant does have a financial incentive to conserve, but the owner doesn't necessarily have an incentive to make the investment that might be necessary in the building in order to achieve that tenant-based energy savings. So we're going to talk now in a little bit more detail about what this means for prioritization and incentive design. If we could go to the next slide. So how do we think about that? Just as an example, in that example where the tenant is paying the utility bill, a direct capital funding support incentive to the owner may be necessary in order to incentivize that owner directly to make an investment in the building, in which case then the tenant is able to see the value of that through their reduced energy bills on a monthly basis. Again, this is one fairly simple example, but it leads us to how we begin to think about effective local approaches. We're going to go now, if we could, to the next slide and talk about how this sets up conversations within as you're putting together your teams and your efforts here, how you want to be thinking about prioritization across a number of key criteria. If we can go to the next slide. So this is where this really comes together. We have a set, as Hannah was alluding to, of energy outcomes. There's a lower cost for owners. There's a decrease in energy consumption and a reduction in carbon emissions. On the right-hand side, we have just as important, a set of housing outcomes, minimizing displacement risk, lowering residents' overall housing and utility burden, and improving housing quality. All of these things are tremendously important and foreseeable outcomes of all of this work. And what we are eager to be a part of as this process proceeds is thinking through what is an appropriate priority for you, given where you are and what tools you have at your disposal. If we can go to the next slide. So to pick an example in which there could be tension and alignment, if a team decides that prioritization really focuses on reduction of costs for tenants, that leads to innovations that decrease household energy cost. And that would be, I think, one very important and particular perspective here. If we go to the next slide, there may be other members within the team for whom the prioritization is on a reduction of carbon emissions, rather. In that case, they may be focused on technological innovations that aren't necessarily reducing costs for tenants. Again, that might involve electrification and sub-metering, in which case a tenant's cost may in fact go up, but carbon emissions, depending on the carbon intensity of the grid electricity, may go down very significantly. So again, both of these are important and positive outcomes. And I think the local team question and challenge, if we go to the next slide, is to begin to think about how to bring all of this together. So what does this look like when it comes together? If I were, for example, here, and again, this is not, there are many different thoughtful answers to this. This is just to try to provide an example of one approach. I want to decrease energy consumption. I want to lower residents' housing and utility costs, and I want to improve housing quality. These are my local priorities. And how can I begin to think about a set of programs that address these? So if we can go to the next slide, please. So in this case, again, this is one sort of example of an intervention here. Again, capital funding to the building owner, which would reduce energy consumption, provide better health outcomes, better housing quality, that are all being used directly to fund building upgrades. Excuse me, in which case, in this instance, the tenants who are paying the utility bills get a lower utility bill each year. But it may not necessarily, in this case, that may create a risk of tenant displacement, depending on the criteria associated with that capital investment upfront. And again, that needs to be sort of comprehensively understood at a local housing market and local regulatory level. If we can go to the next example, please. Again, a different team may choose to prioritize the minimization of displacement on the housing side, paired with a reduction in costs for building owners and a decrease in energy consumption. That leads, if we can go to the next slide, to a different set of interventions. In that case, really a focus on reducing energy and gas usage. So a statewide technical assistance program that might involve efficiency investments at the building level. For example, a high efficiency boiler or heating system, high efficiency lighting. All of these things reduce the owner's cost or the operating cost of the utilities to the building. But if those costs are being borne by the owner, the tenant may experience no change whatsoever in their housing cost. So those investments may very well reduce carbon emissions and reduce energy bills, but they are not impacting the tenants necessarily in any positive way. If we can go to the next slide. And that's really just sort of a series of examples to highlight some of the tensions that we think that this process and this conversation will help to bring to the fore and really, I think, begin to see innovation. We have a case study here of one such example. This is in Massachusetts, a senior housing facility, which is funded in part through the HUD Section 8 program. Hot water and heating systems that are beyond their useful life. Through the building owner was able to access Massachusetts Green Retrofit Initiative funds, which provided, in addition to funding, really a one-stop shop for how to think about energy management. So it's in this case a pretty holistic set of investments. We can go to the next slide to see some of what that has resulted in. An energy audit created a series of scopes of work for investment in the process, and that has reduced gas and electricity consumption quite substantially, total operating expense savings of about $9,000 a year. And again, really very significant in this case, the ability to protect tenants because of the use of the Section 8 funding through that project, but one in which investments through the state program were able to realize really significant operating cost savings, which will, continue for many years to come. So if we can go to the next slide, please, because I want to make sure that we leave room for a review of the Q&A here. So the takeaways here really are that the universe of energy concerns and the universe of housing concerns need to come together in a series of really thoughtful local approaches, which are a combination of the operating and financial considerations of both owners and tenants in multifamily affordable property. And balancing those goals is at the heart of what this challenge, what this conversation is about. How can those goals be balanced? How can they be prioritized? The key to that, we believe, one key to that is multidisciplinary teams who are able to work together and talk to each other and be clear about priorities and be clear about trade-offs. And again, through that process can come, I think, open decisions made with open eyes about what some of those trade-offs look like and how those priorities can best be thought through and communicated at a local and community level. And at the risk of stating the obvious, there's no right or wrong way to pursue building upgrades, but it needs to be done in a way that is really strategic, understanding unintended consequence, understanding measurable benefits, and understanding incentives across, again, building owners, building finance, and building tenants. With that, I'm going to bring us to a moment to answer some of the Q&A. I do want to highlight a series of upcoming webinars beginning May 4th with an informational overview of the prize itself, prizes itself. These are all listed here on the website. 11 a.m. Eastern. May 10th, a training webinar about thinking about geographies and building zones, upgrade zones. May 11th, again, a training webinar about understanding workforce development and economic inclusion. And June 13th, another informational prize overview webinar at 2 p.m. Eastern. And then if we go to the next slide, we are also very excited about a series of office hours, which are exactly as they sound. Drop in to ask and discuss questions. May 2nd, beginning at 12:30 Eastern, a focus on community-driven planning, funding sources for upgrades, energy efficiency programs, and prize and application questions. And then on May 15th, particularly relevant to some of the material we've covered today, how do we think about underserved commercial buildings? Also a chance to ask questions about drivers of energy efficiency and affordable housing. So some of us from HR&A will be in attendance at those office hours if you have any further questions about some of the material we've covered today. And then we're going to move on to our poll questions and Q&A. I hope everybody has had a chance already to, here we go. You should now see a concluding poll to help you think through which topics you still have questions about. What are you interested in exploring more at the office hours? As I said, from HR&A, we will be on during those office hours and want to very much make sure that we're able to prepare ourselves with questions that you may have or further topics that you are interested in. So if everybody can take a minute now, hopefully you're able to see those poll questions. Again, 2 of them on your Zoom screen, and we would appreciate any feedback that folks are able to provide about further topics and further questions. And with that, I want to make sure that we have a few minutes. I think we are doing well on time here to go through, full results. That was very fast. Excellent. To go through and cover some of the Q&A that has come up during the webinar. And I want to thank everybody for your attention and your questions throughout. And it has been a pleasure to cover some complicated and interesting topics.
Thanks, John. Hi, everyone. This is Ian at ACEEE. We've got a great set of questions here, so we'll try to do our best to get through them all. Just to start off, one question that we got from some folks was, will we be able to access the slides or the presentation after? And the answer is yes. We'll be sending out a recording and the slides to registrants. So keep an eye out for that. And then also, there were some Buildings Up Prize questions that came in that were answered in the chat. So if you asked one of those, since they were answered in the chat, we'll come back to those. But first, I want to get to the broader questions about energy efficiency in affordable housing that were raised. Some of these were answered in the chat too, but we'll take them one by one and try to get to them all. So let's see here. So first off, this one was answered in the chat, but Callie, if you could just address it briefly so we have it on the recording. It's related to what is considered affordable housing. And the question is affordable housing defined by gross income or net income?
Sorry, getting off mute. Took a sec. Yes, great question. And when we say 30% of income, we are talking about gross income. So that's your monthly income before tax income. So if 30% of your monthly income goes toward housing and utilities, your gross monthly income, and you're right at that 30%, you're not facing a housing burden.
Thanks. And related to that, we have a question about whether it's different to assess the affordability of housing for renter-occupied housing and owner-occupied housing. If there's any difference in the approach there.
In terms of affordability, using that 30%, I wasn't totally sure of the question. No, really, whether you're a renter and owner, and you think about the wide array of housing in this country, if you're paying more than 30% of your income as an owner toward, housing costs and utilities, you have a housing burden. You're maybe overhoused in a way, right? You might have a mortgage that's too expensive for what you can actually afford. Just leaving, and a lot of people live that way because, we just have to in the cities where we live, just leaves less income for all the other critical expenses of life.
Thanks. And we also got a question for any HRNA folks that want to jump in, and it is related to the cost of upgrading old housing inventory versus the cost of upgrading more recently built housing inventory that might be already somewhat efficient. Can you speak to kind of the considerations that go into those different housing types?
I'm gonna try to answer that in three parts because I read, Ian, maybe a slightly different answer or slightly different question in there, which was, is it more efficient to upgrade existing versus build new? And I think both of those questions are complicated and important questions that obviously depend a huge amount on local considerations. So I think there are obviously upgrading older buildings is expensive in many cases, depending again on the specifics of local labor markets and the particular kinds of interventions that make sense. On the other hand, the ability to do that with an existing building from a carbon perspective allows you to save the embodied carbon in that building, which can be very significant depending on how it was built and when it was built. It also, from a community preservation perspective, can be very beneficial because it allows for at least a greater opportunity for folks who are living in a community, who may have been living in a community for some period of time, not to be displaced. Again, that's not a given, but it is an important set of considerations, and certainly in markets that we've been looking at, both the, I would say, community preservation and the embodied carbon aspects of this conversation have become more and more pressing over the last couple of years.
Thanks. And somewhat related to that, there was a question, a few folks asked questions about what strategies is it important to consider when upgrading naturally occurring affordable housing so that these upgrades don't cause potential displacement or rent increases. And that was answered in the chat, but I think it'd be a good answer or a good question to raise too for the recording.
I haven't seen the answer in the chat, so hopefully what I'm about to say agrees. I think again, this is there are a few markets, New York City being a very significant one, in which there are existing rent protections and rent regulations that protect otherwise unsubsidized affordable housing. In other markets in which those regulations don't exist, there have been experiments at a small scale, but I think important, regarding sort of covenants along with the money. So if you are accessing, in some cases, private capital that will say, we're going to give you this money and you're going to do the following upgrades, and in return, we're going to make sure that rent increases don't go above some certain amount, and or that existing tenants aren't displaced. So those provisions have been part of, again, small numbers of, I think, important examples, because it is, as we've said, a really significant aspect of the local conversation around building upgrades at scale. Is very, very real concerns from tenants about either direct displacement or cost increases that effectively force displacement. And those kinds of limits associated with financing sources have proven to be important tools in some of these investments to date. Callie, do you have anything you want to add to that from other examples you've seen?
I think I would just add that there's not really a clear guardrail for the concern that rent increases and could lead to tenants being pushed out, right? Displacement. That said, in designing a retrofit program, we do think there are examples where the program required the participant owners to agree not to raise the rent, but that has to be a carrot and stick, right? Like if they're getting financing from that's subsidized financing, or getting it from local government or federal credit or something, it has to kind of be a reasonable requirement about not raising the rent, for a number of years as a condition of the program of participation. You can't set it so stringent or in such an unreasonable way that the owner just wouldn't participate in the first place, right? Because that's kind of the poison pill. If you want the retrofits to happen, you have to figure out right at the margins, how do we set the right incentives? And I think a lot of that is talking to owners, like talk to owners and hear what they have to say and what else is on the table in these negotiations, because perhaps it's a matter of like, if I could get residents to sign longer leases, I wouldn't have to be as concerned about turnover. There's just other things that you can bring to these discussions. So think about just talking to the owners about their pain points.
And I think what Callie's getting at is part of why we are so excited by this effort, because I think the multiple pathways to successful interventions here are going to require those multidisciplinary approaches. If you simply try to solve this and address it as an energy consumption problem, you will be missing a huge bucket of housing needs, very real housing concerns. On the flip side, if you view this solely as a housing and housing affordability issue, you will be inevitably missing a tremendous amount of understanding, knowledge, and perspective from the energy universe. And we really believe that the best pathways forward are going to be when all of those interests are able to be working together as part of multidisciplinary teams at a local level to be able to create locally appropriate and locally implementable solutions.
Great. And we had another question come in related to whether there's a general framework or rubric that assesses energy efficiency impact in affordable housing. Does the group have any thoughts on that? If there's one that is in the ether that we can recommend for people to look at?
Is this a question about like a sample sustainability plan, that question?
That was a separate question, but I think there's overlap between the two. So definitely we can take that question too. If there's, that one came in. It was, does HUD or HRNA know of a sample sustainability plan for HUD subsidized developments? So I think they're related but slightly different, but feel free to take either.
I see Lauren popping on. Maybe she can speak to it.
Sure. So we don't have templates and we don't require these across the board for the properties receiving HUD assistance, but I think a good place to start, and I can put a contact name in the chat, is DOE and HUD's Better Buildings Challenge program. They have a good history. I think it's been underway for about 10 years now. They have a good track record of collecting best practices in the space. And there is going to be a lot of variability across how owners go about conducting energy audits or sustainability plans. But I think it'd be a good place to start in terms of gathering some best practices or even templates. A lot of the partner participants on the multifamily side, many of them being HUD assisted properties, do often make their resources available you know, kind of as a community of practice. And so I'm happy to share that contact information in the chat.
And I would just add to that, on the non-regulated housing side, most utilities, at least the ones that I'm aware of, do also have some level of assistance for energy audits. One of which is that they'll give you a sample of what it looks like, so that you can have a sense of what kinds of interventions tend to result. And those do vary geographically. You know, what you would see in the Northeast is very different from what you see in hotter and drier climates in the Southwest, for example. And so just to even get a sense of what a template one energy audit looks like is very helpful. And in my experience, something that you're able to access through local utilities who have their own reasons for often incentivizing those energy audits as well. And that can be a very useful resource.
There was a question that came in related to audits and assessments, and it was, what's the typical lifespan for a needs assessment or an energy audit for a building? And I think that's an interesting question. Does anyone have any thoughts on that?
It's a great question. And I think I would say only that I think the question was referring to something from 2017. So my gut is probably some of that is still relevant. And particularly things like insulation and sort of pipe wrap tend to be pretty standard as part of those audits, and probably those are conditions that don't get better on their own. But I will say that the technology here is pretty rapidly improving. So my guess is an audit, if it's from a cold weather climate in 2017, probably isn't suggesting heat pumps as a long-term solution. We now have a much better track record in cold weather climates of how those things actually perform. And the track record has been quite positive. So I suspect that the technology is improving quickly enough that 5 years is probably not as helpful as you would want it to be. Though it probably still does point you to some things that are useful. So I think, again, most of the utilities that we're aware of have some level of assistance available, financial assistance available, and technical assistance available to buildings in terms of audits. And there is if you are in a position of thinking about long-term planning, it's a great tool, and it can be very powerful when sort of it's fresh.
Great. And we are short on time, so I'm going to try to get to as many questions as I can, but I just want to say, if anyone's questions are not answered, you can email buildingsup@nrel.gov, especially with questions about the prize, and we will get to those. On that note, there is another Buildings Up question that came in. So Nate, this is for you. Someone asked, is there a particular priority for impact in the Buildings Up challenge when comparing proposed outreach or education efforts versus training or tangible facilities improvements?
Thanks, Ian. I hate to punt, but I'm going to refer to the rules and ask that if there's more specificity to that, please email us. It's hard to. Right now, we're focused on phase 1 concept, and it's hard for me to evaluate that without more information. So check out the rules document, please, which I've linked in the chat, and email us if you still have questions.
Thanks. And we have about 2 minutes left, so I think we'll get to one more question, and then we'll have to call it at 2:30. A question came in about establishing trust with low and median income residents who may be wary about participating in programs for retrofit upgrades. Do folks have any thoughts on that? How to structure a initiative so that there's trust built with the residents that are being affected?
I think, again, this is a very local question, and you need to bring the right people to the table to build that trust. We can't tell you who those folks are, but putting that team together is critical. And there actually are a lot of good case studies out here. And I know we've got some that we're putting together in our resource library. I know that some of the work that LISC Boston does is really focused on establishing that trust. LISC and Enterprise and some of the CDFIs who are community development CDFIs also doing sustainability work. So I would say those are folks to talk to and understand kind of how they went about building that trust, because that lack of trust exists for a lot of very real reasons, hundreds of years of reasons, and possibly, you know, much more recent problems too. So yeah, we'll make sure we include some good case studies in our resource library.
I'll just quickly add, we did a webinar, I think it was a few weeks ago, on engaging stakeholders, and there may be some content as part of that that would be helpful as well. So feel free to check that out on HeroX. But I think to Callie's point, it's important to recognize why there is a lack of trust at the outset as well. But I think there's some resources related to this on HeroX, so check that out.
Well, thanks everyone for attending today. Again, please reach out to buildingsup@nrel.gov with additional questions, and have a great afternoon.